Hello. It is I, Low Energy Videos, the man who is always too far away from his mic. Today we'll be listening to Empire Legacy of Ashes, for it is Empire of Dirt, for it is Monday. Technically I should have a second show lined up. Today, Krendar and I will be over on YouTube. And there it is. And we will be reacting to the latest episode of Space King, as well as watching the video, like the behind the scenes video and everything. So that should be pretty good. You guys know what it's all about now. You might be watching this here, or you might be watching this over on YouTube. If so, please like, share, and subscribe. The Legacy of Ashes audiobook is in my YouTube link. I don't think it's here. So I shall post it in the chat. There. Go and watch it. Go and listen to it. Go and like it. And if you really like it, go and buy it. I don't know what else to say at this point. Other than my back is a little sore. I did my exercises, but I sat a lot more here today than I normally do. And probably at a really bad angle. So I'm going to go and pop a pill real quick. And then we'll get started. I have my coffee here. Other than that, it's been an okay-ish day. Made some plans for future UFF. We shall see. Chatted to someone. Might have some big plans come New Year's. That'd be fun. Again, we shall see. We shall see. Paracetamol. It mildly helps. At this point, if you don't know what I'm doing, well, that's silly. But I can give you a quick breakdown. I play a game. It ain't all that important. And while I play the game, we listen to an audiobook. We are currently a good chunk into part 1 of this thing. It's about the history of the CIA. It's very cool. And, yeah. I don't know what else to tell you. Like, seriously. What more can you do to me? Okay.
Leader of Latin American democratic and anti-dictator forces. Our hand should not show. The president was furious to find that the CIA had misjudged Castro. Though our intelligence experts backed and filled for a number of months, Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs, events were gradually driving them to the conclusion that with the coming of Castro, communism had penetrated this hemisphere. On December 11, 1959, having reached that conclusion, Richard Bissell sent Allen Dulles a memo suggesting that thorough consideration be given to the elimination of Fidel Castro. Dulles penciled in a crucial correction to the proposal. He struck out elimination, a word tinged with more than a hint of murder. He substituted removal from Cuba and gave the go-ahead.
That's cute.
On January 8, 1960, Dulles told Bissell to organize a special task force to overthrow Castro. Bissell personally selected many of the same people who had subverted the government of Guatemala 6 years before and had deceived President Eisenhower face to face about the coup. He chose the feckless Tracy Barnes for political and psychological warfare, the talented Dave Phillips for propaganda, the gung-ho Rip Robertson for paramilitary training, and the relentlessly mediocre E. Howard Hunt to manage the political front groups. Their chief would be Jake Esterline, who had run the Washington War Room for Operation Success. Esterline was station chief in Venezuela when he first laid eyes on Fidel Castro in early 1959. He had watched the young Comandante touring Caracas, fresh from his New Year's Day triumph over the dictator Fulgencio Batista, and he had heard the crowds cheering Castro as a conqueror. I saw, hell, anybody with eyes could see, that a new and powerful force was at work in the hemisphere, Esterline said. It had to be dealt with. Esterline returned to CIA headquarters in January 1960 to receive his appointment as Cuba Task Force Chief. The group took shape as a secret cell inside the CIA. All the money, all the information, and all the decisions for the Cuban task force came through Bissell. He had little interest in the work of his spies, much less gathering intelligence from inside Cuba. He never stopped to analyze what would happen if the coup against Castro succeeded, or if it failed. I don't think these kinds of things were ever thought about in any depth, Esterline said. I think their first reaction was, God, we've got a possible communist in here. We had better get him out just the way we got our Benz out in Guatemala. Bissell almost never talked about Cuba with Richard Helms, his second-in-command at the clandestine service. The two men disliked and distrusted one another intensely. Helms did weigh in on one idea that filtered up from the Cuba task force. It was a propaganda ploy. A Cuban agent, trained by the CIA, would appear on the shores of Istanbul, claiming to be a political prisoner who had just jumped from a Soviet ship. He would proclaim that Castro was enslaving thousands of his people and shipping them to Siberia. The plan was known as the Dripping Cuban. Helms killed it. On March 2nd, 1960, 2 weeks before President Eisenhower approved a covert action against Castro, Dulles briefed Vice President Nixon on operations already underway. Reading from a 7-page paper initialed by Bissell titled, What We Are Doing in Cuba, Dulles specified acts of economic warfare, sabotage, political propaganda, and a plan to use a drug which, if placed in Castro's food, would make him behave in such an irrational manner that a public appearance could well have very damaging results to him. Nixon was all for it. Dulles and Bissell presented their plans to Eisenhower and Nixon at the White House in a 4-man meeting at 2:30 p.m. on March 17, 1960. They did not propose to invade the island. They told Eisenhower that they could overthrow Castro by sleight of hand. They would create a responsible, appealing, and unified Cuban opposition led by recruited agents. A clandestine radio station would beam propaganda into Havana to spark an uprising. CIA officers at the U.S. Army's jungle warfare training camp in Panama would school 60 Cubans to infiltrate the island. The CIA would drop arms and ammunition to them. Fidel would fall 6 to 8 months thereafter, Bissell promised. The timing was excruciatingly sensitive. Election Day was 7.5 months away. Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Nixon had won by wide margins in the New Hampshire presidential primaries the week before. Eisenhower's staff secretary, General Andrew Goodpaster, took notes on the meeting. The president says he knows of no better plan. The great problem is leakage and security. Everyone must be prepared to swear that he had not heard of it. Our hand should not show in anything that is done. The agency should have needed no reminder that under its charter, all covert action required secrecy so secure that no evidence would lead to the president. But Eisenhower wanted to make sure the CIA did its best to keep this one under cover. We were going to pay for that lie. The president and Dick Bissell were locked in an increasingly intense struggle over the control of one of the biggest secrets of all, the U-2 spy plane. Eisenhower had not allowed any flights over Soviet terrain since his talks with Khrushchev at Camp David 6 months earlier. Khrushchev had returned from Washington praising the president's courage in seeking peaceful coexistence. Eisenhower wanted the spirit of Camp David to be his legacy. Bissell was fighting as hard as possible to resume the secret missions. The president was torn. He truly wanted the intelligence that the U-2 gleaned. He longed to bury the missile gap, the false claims by the CIA, the Air Force, military contractors, and politicians of both parties that the Soviets had a widening lead in nuclear weaponry. The CIA's formal estimates of Soviet military strength were not based on intelligence, but on politics and guesswork. Since 1957, the CIA had sent Eisenhower terrifying reports that the Soviet buildup of nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles was far faster and much greater than the American arsenal. In 1960, the agency projected a mortal threat to the United States. It told the president that the Soviets would have 500 ICBMs ready to strike by 1961. The Strategic Air Command used those estimates as the basis for a secret first strike plan using more than 3,000 nuclear warheads to destroy every city and every military outpost from Warsaw to Beijing. But Moscow did not have 500 nuclear missiles pointed at the United States at the time. It had 4. The president had worried for 5.5 years that the U-2 itself might start World War III. If the plane went down over the Soviet Union, it could take the chance for peace with it. The month after the Camp David dialogues with Khrushchev, the president had rejected a newly proposed U-2 mission over the Soviet Union. He told Allen Dulles once again, bluntly, that divining the intentions of the Soviets through espionage was more important to him than discovering details about their military capabilities. Only spies, not gadgets, could tell him about Soviet intent to attack. Without that knowledge, the president said, the U-2 flights were provocative pinpricking, and it may give them the idea that we are seriously preparing plans to knock out their installations with a sneak attack. Eisenhower had a summit meeting with Khrushchev set for May 16, 1960, in Paris. He feared that his greatest asset, his reputation for honesty, would be squandered if a U-2 went down while the United States was, in his words, engaged in apparently sincere deliberations with the Soviets. In theory, only the president had the power to order a U-2 mission. But Bissell ran the program, and he was petulant about filing his flight plans. He tried to evade presidential authority by secretly seeking to outsource flights to the British and to the Chinese nationalists. In his memoirs, he wrote that Allen Dulles had been horrified to learn that the first U-2 flight had passed directly over Moscow and Leningrad. The director had never known. Bissell never saw fit to tell him. He argued for weeks with the White House before Eisenhower finally gave in and agreed to an April 9, 1960 flight over the Soviet Union from Pakistan. It was, on the surface, a success. But the Soviets knew their airspace had been violated once again, and they went on high alert. Bissell fought for one more flight. The president set a deadline of April 25th. The date came and went, with clouds covering the communist targets. Bissell pleaded for more time, and Eisenhower gave him 6 days' reprieve. The following Sunday was to be the final date for a flight before the Paris summit. Bissell then tried to circumvent the White House by going to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to win their backing for yet another flight. In his zeal, he had neglected to plan for disaster. On May Day, as the president had feared, the U-2 was shot down in central Russia. The CIA's pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive. C. Douglas Dillon was the acting Secretary of State that day. The president told me to work with Allen Dulles, Dillon recounted. We had to put out some sort of announcement. To the shock of both men, NASA announced that a weather plane had been lost in Turkey. That was the CIA's cover story. The Director of Central Intelligence either never knew about it or had forgotten all about it. "We couldn't understand how this had happened," Dillon said, "but we had to get ourselves out of it." That proved difficult. Hewing to the cover story, the White House and the State Department deceived the American people for a week about the flight. Their lies grew more and more transparent. The last one came on May 7th. There was no authorization for such a flight. That broke Eisenhower's spirit. He couldn't allow Allen Dulles to take all the blame because it would look like the president didn't know what was going on in the government, Dillon said. Eisenhower walked into the Oval Office on May 9th and said out loud, "I would like to resign." For the first time in the history of the United States, millions of citizens understood that their president could deceive them in the name of national security. The doctrine of plausible deniability was dead. The summit with Khrushchev was wrecked, and the brief thaw in the Cold War iced over. The CIA spy plane destroyed the idea of détente for almost a decade. Eisenhower had approved the final mission in the hope of putting the lie to the missile gap, but the cover-up of the crash made him out to be a liar. In retirement, Eisenhower said the greatest regret of his presidency was the lie we told about the U-2. I didn't realize how high a price we were going to pay for that lie. The president knew he would not be able to leave office in a spirit of international peace and reconciliation. He was now intent on policing as many parts of the planet as possible before leaving office. The summer of 1960 became a season of incessant crisis for the CIA. Red arrows signifying hotspots in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia multiplied on the maps that Allen Dulles and his men brought to the White House. The chagrin over the U-2 shoot-down gave way to a murderous anger. First, Dick Bissell redoubled the CIA's plans for overthrowing Cuba. He set up a new CIA station in Coral Gables, Florida, codenamed WAVE. He told Vice President Nixon that he would need a force of 500 trained Cuban exiles, up from 60 men a few weeks before, to lead the fight. But the Army's Jungle Warfare Center in Panama could not handle hundreds more raw recruits. So Bissell sent Jake Esterline down to Guatemala, where he single-handedly negotiated a secret agreement with President Manuel Irigoras Fuentes, a retired general and a skilled wheeler-dealer. The site he secured became the main training camp for the Bay of Pigs, with its own airport, its own brothel, and its own codes of conduct. The CIA's Cubans found it entirely unsatisfactory, reported Marine Colonel Jack Hawkins, Esterline's top paramilitary planner. They lived in prison camp conditions, which produced political complications that were very difficult for CIA to handle. Though the camp was isolated, the Guatemalan army was well aware of it, and the presence of a foreign force on its soil very nearly led to a military coup against their president. Then, in mid-August, courtly, charming Dick Bissell put out a mafia contract against Fidel Castro. He went to Colonel Sheffield Edwards, the CIA's chief of security, and asked the colonel to put him in touch with a gangster who could carry out a hit. This time he briefed Dulles, who gave his approval. An agency historian concluded, Bissell probably believed that Castro would be dead at the hands of a CIA-sponsored assassin before the brigade ever hit the beach at the Bay of Pigs. Bissell's men, knowing nothing of the mafia plan, worked on a second murder plot. The question was how to put a trained CIA killer within shooting distance of Fidel. Can we get a Rip Robertson close to him? Can we get a really hairy Cuban? I mean a gutsy Cuban, said Dick Drain, the Cuba Task Force's chief of operations. The answer was always no. Miami was crawling with thousands of Cuban exiles ready to join the CIA's increasingly well-known covert operation. But Castro's spies were rife among them, and Fidel learned a fair amount about the CIA's plans. An FBI agent named George Davis, after spending a few months listening to loose-lipped Cubans in Miami coffee shops and bars, gave a CIA officer at the Wave station some friendly advice. It would be impossible to overthrow Castro with these chatty Cuban exiles. The only hope was to send in the Marines.
Get drunk and say,
His
"I'm gonna
CIA
kill
colleague
Castro."
relayed the message to headquarters. It was ignored. On August 18, 1960, Dulles and Bissell discussed the Cuba task force in private with President Eisenhower for less than 20 minutes. Bissell asked for another $10.75 million to begin the paramilitary training of the 500 Cubans in Guatemala. Eisenhower said yes, on one condition: so long as the Joint Chiefs, Defense, State, and CIA think we have a good chance of being successful in freeing the Cubans from this incubus. When Bissell tried to raise the idea of creating an American military force to lead the Cubans in battle, Dulles twice cut him off, evading debate and dissent. The President, the man who had led the biggest secret invasion in American history, warned the CIA's leaders against the danger of making false moves or starting something before we were ready. To avoid another Cuba. Later that same day, at a meeting of the National Security Council, the President ordered the Director of Central Intelligence to eliminate the man the CIA saw as the Castro of Africa, Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Congo. Lumumba had been freely elected, and he appealed to the United States for assistance as his nation shook off Belgium's brutal colonial rule and declared its independence in the summer of 1960. American help never came, for the CIA regarded Lumumba as a dope-addled communist dupe. So when Belgian paratroopers flew in to reassert control in the capital, Lumumba accepted Soviet planes, trucks, and technicians to bolster his barely functioning government.
Why the hell?
The week that the Belgian soldiers arrived, Dulles sent Larry Devlin, the station chief in Brussels, to take charge of the CIA post in the capital of the Congo and assess Lumumba as a target for covert action. On August 18th, after 6 weeks in the country, Devlin cabled CIA headquarters. Congo experiencing classic communist effort takeover. Whether or not Lumumba actual commie or playing commie game, there may be little time left in which to take action to avoid another Cuba. Allen Dulles delivered the gist of this message at the NSC meeting that same day. According to secret Senate testimony delivered years later by the NSC's note-taker Robert Johnson, President Eisenhower then turned to Dulles and said flatly that Lumumba should be eliminated. After a dead silence of 15 seconds or so, the meeting went on. Dulles cabled Devlin 8 days later. In high quarters here, it is the clear-cut conclusion that if LLL continues to hold high office, the inevitable result will at best be chaos and at worst pave the way to communist takeover of the Congo. We conclude that his removal must be an urgent and prime objective, and that under existing conditions this would be a high priority of our covert action. Hence, we wish to give you wider authority. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's club-footed master chemist, brought an airline carry-on bag containing vials of lethal toxins to the Congo and handed it to the station chief. It held a hypodermic syringe to inject the lethal drops into food, drink, or a tube of toothpaste. It was Devlin's job to deliver death to Lumumba. The two men held a nervous conversation in Devlin's apartment on or about the night of September 10th. I asked on whose orders these instructions were issued, Devlin said under oath in secret testimony declassified in 1998. The answer was the President. Devlin testified that he locked the toxins in his office safe and agonized over what to do. He remembered thinking, I'll be damned if I'm going to leave that lying around. In time, he took the poison vials out to the banks of the Congo River and buried them. He said he was ashamed of the order to kill Lumumba. He knew there were other means at the CIA's disposal. The agency had already selected the Congo's next leader, Joseph Mobutu. the only man in the Congo able to act with firmness, as Dulles told the president at the NSC meeting on September 21st. The CIA delivered $250,000 to him in early October, followed by shipments of arms and ammunition in November. Mobutu captured Lumumba and, in Devlin's words, delivered him into the hands of a sworn enemy. The CIA base in Elizabethville, deep in the heart of the Congo, reported that a Belgian officer of Flemish origin executed Lumumba with a burst of submachine gun fire 2 nights before the next president of the United States took office. With the unwavering support of the CIA, Mobutu finally gained full control of the Congo after a 5-year power struggle. He was the agency's favorite ally in Africa and the clearinghouse for American covert action throughout the continent during the Cold War. He ruled for 3 decades as one of the world's most brutal and corrupt dictators, stealing billions of dollars in revenues from the nation's enormous deposits of diamonds, minerals, and strategic metals, slaughtering multitudes to preserve his power.
Yep.
An absolutely untenable position.
African dictators you think of.
As the 1960 election drew near, it was clear to Vice President Nixon that the CIA was far from ready to attack Cuba. At the end of September, Nixon nervously instructed the task force, "Don't do anything now. Wait until after the elections." The delay gave Fidel Castro a crucial edge. His spies told him an American-backed invasion might be imminent, and he built up his military and intelligence forces, cracking down hard on the political dissidents whom the CIA hoped would serve as shock troops for the coup. The internal resistance against Castro began to die that summer, though the CIA never paid much heed to what was actually happening on the island. Tracy Barnes privately commissioned a public opinion poll in Cuba, and it showed that people overwhelmingly supported Castro. Disliking the results, he discarded them. The agency's effort to drop arms to rebels on the island was a fiasco. On September 28th, a pallet of machine guns, rifles, and Colt 45s for 100 fighters floated down to Cuba from a CIA plane flying out of Guatemala. The drop missed its target by 7 miles. Castro's forces seized the arms, captured the Cuban CIA agent set to receive them, and shot him. The pilot got lost on his way back and landed in southern Mexico, where the local police seized the plane. In all, 30 such missions were flown. At most, 3 succeeded. By early October, the CIA realized that it knew next to nothing about the anti-Castro forces inside Cuba. We had no confidence that they weren't penetrated by Castro's spies, Jake Esterline said. He now was certain that Castro could not be overthrown by subtle subversion. We had made a major effort at infiltration and resupply, and those efforts had been unsuccessful, Bissell recalled. He decided that what was needed was a shock action, a full-scale invasion.
Sure, I'll do that.
The CIA had neither presidential approval nor the troops needed to carry out that mission. The 500 men undergoing training in Guatemala were a preposterously inadequate number, Bissell told Esterline. Both men realized that only a far larger force could succeed against Castro, who had a 60,000-man army with tanks and artillery, along with an increasingly cruel and efficient internal security service. Bissell had the Mafia on one phone line, the White House on another. The presidential election was looming. Sometime during the first week of November 1960, the core concept of the Cuban operation cracked under the pressure. Esterline pronounced the plan unworkable, and Bissell knew he was right. But he told no one. In the months and weeks and days before the invasion, he retreated into deception. He was lying down and he was lying up, Jake Esterline said. Down to the CIA's Cuba task force, up to the president and the new president-elect. John Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in November by fewer than 120,000 votes. Some Republicans thought the election was stolen in the political precincts of Chicago. Others pointed at vote buying in West Virginia. Richard Nixon blamed the CIA. He was convinced, wrongly, that Georgetown liberals like Dulles and Bissell had secretly aided Kennedy with inside information on Cuba before a crucial televised presidential debate. President-elect Kennedy immediately announced the reappointments of J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles. That decision came from his father, and it was made for political and personal protection. Hoover knew some of the deeper secrets in the Kennedy family, including the president-elect's sexual dalliances during World War II with a suspected Nazi spy, and he had shared that knowledge with Dulles. Kennedy knew all this because his father, a former member of Eisenhower's Board of Foreign Intelligence Consultants, had told him on good authority. On November 18th, the president-elect met Dulles and Bissell at his father's retreat in Palm Beach, Florida. 3 days before, Bissell had received a conclusive report from Esterline on the Cuban operation. Our original concept is now seen to be unachievable in the face of the controls Castro has instituted, Esterline said. There will not be the internal unrest earlier believed possible, nor will the defenses permit the type of strike first planned. Our second concept, a 1,500 to 3,000 man force to secure a beach with airstrip, is now also seen as unachievable, except as a joint agency DoD action. In other words, to overthrow Castro, the United States would have to send in the Marines. I sat there in my office at CIA, Esterline recounted, and I said, God damn it, I hope Bissell has enough guts to tell John Kennedy what the facts are. But Bissell never breathed a word. The unachievable plan became a can-do mission. The Palm Beach briefing placed the CIA leaders in an absolutely untenable position, Bissell told an agency historian. Their notes for the meeting show that they had intended to discuss their past triumphs, particularly Guatemala, and a multitude of covert operations underway in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Central and South America, and Asia. But they did not. Before the meeting, President Eisenhower told them to hew a narrow agenda. They interpreted that as a ban on discussing anything that had transpired in the meetings of the National Security Council. As a result, crucial information about the CIA's covert operations was lost in transition from one president to another. Eisenhower had never approved an invasion of Cuba, but Kennedy did not know that. What he knew was what Dulles and Bissell told him. An 8-year defeat. For 8 years, Allen Dulles had fended off all efforts by outsiders to change the CIA. He had a reputation to protect, the agency's and his own. Denying everything, admitting nothing, he had hidden the truth to conceal the failures of his covert operations. From at least 1957 onward, he had shunned voices of reason and moderation, ignored the increasingly urgent recommendations of the President's intelligence consultants, brushed aside reports by his own Inspector General, treated his underlings with contempt. He was, by that time, a tired old man, whose professional conduct could be, and usually was, trying in the extreme, said Dick Lemon, one of the best analysts the agency ever had. His treatment of us reflected his sense of values. He was wrong, of course, but we had to live with it. In his last days in office, President Eisenhower came to understand that he did not have a spy service worthy of the name. He came to that conclusion after reading through a thick stack of reports he had commissioned in the hope of changing the CIA. The first, on December 15, 1960, was the work of the Joint Study Group, which he had created after the U-2 shoot-down to survey the landscape of American intelligence. It was a terrifying picture of drift and disarray. It said Dulles never had addressed the problem of a surprise attack by the Soviets. He had never coordinated military intelligence and civilian analysis. He had never created the capability to provide warning in a crisis. He had spent 8 years mounting covert operations instead of mastering American intelligence. Then, on January 5, 1961, the President's Board of Consultants on Foreign Intelligence Activities issued its final recommendations. It called for a total reassessment of covert action. We are unable to conclude that, on balance, all of the covert action programs undertaken by CIA up to this time have been worth the risk of the great expenditure of manpower, money, and other resources involved. It warned that CIA's concentration on political, psychological, and related covert action activities have tended to distract substantially from the execution of its primary intelligence-gathering mission. The board urged the President to consider the complete separation of the Director of Central Intelligence from the CIA. It said Dulles was incapable of running the agency while carrying out his duties to coordinate American intelligence. The code-making and code-breaking of the National Security Agency, the dawning capabilities of spy satellites and space photo reconnaissance, the endless squabbles of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. I reminded the President that many times he had addressed himself to this general problem. His national security aide, Gordon Gray, wrote after reviewing the report with Eisenhower. "I know," Ike replied. "I've tried. I cannot change Allen Dulles." A great deal has been accomplished, Dulles insisted to the President at the final gatherings of Eisenhower's National Security Council. "Everything is well in hand," he said. "I have fixed the clandestine service. American intelligence has never been more agile and adept. Coordination and cooperation are better than they have ever been. The proposals of the President's Intelligence Board were preposterous," he said. "They were madness. They were illegal. I am responsible under the law for intelligence coordination," he reminded the President. "I cannot delegate that responsibility. Without my leadership," he said, "American intelligence would be a body floating in thin air." At the last, Dwight Eisenhower exploded in anger and frustration. "The structure of our intelligence organization is faulty," he told Dulles. "It makes no sense, it has to be reorganized, and we should have done it long ago." Nothing had changed since Pearl Harbor. "I have suffered an 8-year defeat on this," said the President of the United States. He would leave a legacy of ashes to his successor.
Name. Title drop.
Part 3. Lost Causes. The CIA under Kennedy and Johnson, 1961 to 1968. 17. Nobody knew what to do. The legacy was handed down on the morning of January 19, 1961, when the old general and the young senator met alone in the Oval Office. With a sense of foreboding, Eisenhower gave Kennedy a glance at the stratagems of national security, nuclear weapons, and covert operations. The two men emerged and met in the cabinet room with the old and new Secretaries of State, Defense, and the Treasury. Senator Kennedy asked the President's judgment as to the United States supporting the guerrilla operations in Cuba, even if this support involves the United States publicly, a note-taker recorded that morning. The President replied, "Yes, as we cannot let the present government there go on." The President also advised that the situation would be helped if we could handle the Dominican Republic at the same time. Eisenhower's idea that one Caribbean coup could counterbalance another was an equation no one in Washington had worked out. As Kennedy arose the next morning for his swearing-in, the corrupt right-wing leader of the Dominican Republic, Generalissimo Rafael Trujillo, had been in power for 30 years. Support from the U.S. government and the American business community had helped keep him in office. He ruled by force, fraud, and fear. He took pleasure in hanging his enemies from meat hooks. He had his torture chambers, he had his political assassinations, said Consul General Henry Dearborn, the ranking American diplomat in the Dominican Republic at the start of 1961. But he kept law and order, cleaned the place up, made it sanitary, built public works, and he didn't bother the United States, so that was fine with us. But Trujillo had become intolerable, Dearborn said. About the time I got there, his iniquities had gotten so bad that there was a lot of pressure from various political groups, civil rights groups, and others, not only in the U.S., but throughout the hemisphere, that something just had to be done about this man. Dearborn was left in charge of the American embassy in Santo Domingo after the United States severed diplomatic relations with the Dominican Republic in August 1960. All but a few of the American diplomats and spies left the island. But Richard Bissell had asked Dearborn to stay on and serve as the acting CIA station chief. The consul general agreed. On January 19, 1961, Dearborn was advised that a shipment of small arms was on its way to a group of Dominican conspirators who aimed to kill Trujillo. The special group, Allen Dulles presiding, had made the decision 1 week before. Dearborn requested the agency's approval to arm the Dominicans with 3 carbine rifles left behind at the embassy by Navy personnel. Bissell's covert action deputy, Tracy Barnes, gave the green light. The CIA then dispatched 3 .38 caliber pistols to the Dominicans. Bissell authorized a second shipment of 4 machine guns and 240 rounds of ammunition. The machine guns remained at the American consulate in Santo Domingo after members of the new administration questioned what the world reaction might be if it were known that the United States was delivering murder weapons via diplomatic pouch.
Murder weapons.
Dearborn received a cable, personally approved by President Kennedy, which he read to say, "We don't care if the Dominicans assassinate Trujillo, that is all right, but we don't want anything to pin this on us." Nothing ever did. When Trujillo's killers shot him 2 weeks later, the smoking gun might or might not have been the agency's. There were no fingerprints. But the assassination was as close as the CIA had ever come to carrying out a murder at the command of the White House. The Attorney General of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy, jotted down some notes after he learned of the assassination. "The great problem now," he wrote, "is that we don't know what to do." I was ashamed of my country. As the CIA catapulted toward the invasion of Cuba, things started to steamroller and get out of control, said Jake Esterline. Bissell was the driving force. He forged on, refusing to acknowledge that the CIA could not topple Castro, blinding himself to the fact that the secrecy of the operation had been blown long ago. On March 11th, Bissell went to the White House with 4 separate plots on paper. None satisfied President Kennedy. He gave the chief of the clandestine service 3 days to come up with something better. Bissell's brainstorm was his choice of a new landing zone, 3 broad beaches at the Bay of Pigs. The site satisfied a new political requirement from the administration. The Cuban invaders had to capture an airstrip upon landing to establish a political beachhead for a new Cuban government. Bissell assured the president that this operation would succeed. The worst that could happen was that the CIA's rebels would confront Castro's forces on the beaches and march on into the mountains. But the terrain at the Bay of Pigs was an impassable tangle of mangrove roots and mud. No one in Washington knew that. The crude survey maps in the CIA's possession suggesting that the swampland would serve as guerrilla country had been drawn in 1895. The following week, the CIA's mafia contacts took a swipe at killing Castro. They gave poison pills and thousands of dollars to one of the CIA's most prominent Cubans, Tony Verona, described by Esterline as a scoundrel, a cheat, and a thief. Verona later met President Kennedy at the White House. Verona managed to hand off the vial of poison to a restaurant worker in Havana who was to slip it into Castro's ice cream cone. Cuban intelligence officers later found the vial in an icebox frozen to the coils. By spring, the president still had not approved a plan of attack. He did not understand how the invasion would work. On Wednesday, April 5th, he met again with Dulles and Bissell, but could not make sense of their strategy. On Thursday, April 6th, he asked them if their planned bombing of Castro's small air force would eliminate the invaders' element of surprise. No one had an answer. On Saturday night, April 8th, Richard Bissell answered the insistent ring of his home phone. Jake Esterline was calling from Quarters I, the CIA's Washington War Room, saying he and Colonel Hawkins, his paramilitary planner, needed to see Bissell alone as soon as possible. Sunday morning, Bissell opened his front door to find Esterline and Hawkins in a state of barely controlled rage. They marched into his living room, sat down, and told him that the invasion of Cuba had to be called off. It was too late to stop now, Bissell told them. The coup against Castro was set to begin in a week. Esterline and Hawkins threatened to resign. Bissell questioned their loyalty and patriotism. They wavered. If you don't want a disaster, we absolutely must take out all of Castro's Air Force, Esterline told Bissell, not for the first time. All three knew that Castro's 36 combat aircraft were capable of killing hundreds of the CIA's Cubans as they went ashore. Trust me, said Bissell. He promised to persuade President Kennedy to wipe out Castro's Air Force. He talked us into continuing, Esterline recalled bitterly. He said, I promise you that there will be no reductions of air raids. But at the crucial hour, Bissell cut the American force sent to destroy Castro's aircraft in half, from 16 to 8 bombers. He did it to please the president, who wanted a quiet coup. Bissell deceived him into believing the CIA would deliver one. On Saturday, April 15th, 8 American B-26 bombers struck 3 Cuban airfields as the CIA's brigade of 1,511 men headed for the Bay of Pigs. 5 Cuban aircraft were destroyed and perhaps a dozen more damaged. Half of Castro's Air Force remained. The CIA's cover story was that the attacker was a sole Cuban Air Force defector who had landed in Florida. That day, Bissell sent Tracy Barnes to New York to peddle the tale to the American ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson. Bissell and Barnes played Stevenson for a fool, as if he were their agent. Like Secretary of State Colin Powell on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, Stevenson sold the CIA story to the world. Unlike Powell, he discovered the next day that he had been had. The knowledge that Stevenson had been lying in public riveted Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who already had good reason to be enraged with the CIA. Only hours before, on the heels of another blown operation, Rusk had to send a formal letter of apology to Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. The secret police in Singapore had burst into a CIA safe house where a cabinet minister on the CIA's payroll was being interrogated. Lee Kuan Yew, a key American ally, said that the station chief offered him a $3.3 million bribe to hush up the matter. At 6 p.m. on Sunday, April 16th, Stevenson cabled Rusk from New York to warn of the gravest risk of another U-2 disaster in such uncoordinated action. At 9:30 p.m., the president's national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, called Dulles' deputy director, General Charles Pierre Cabell. Bundy said the CIA could not launch airstrikes on Cuba unless they could be conducted from a strip within the beachhead at the Bay of Pigs. At 10:15 p.m., Cabell and Bissell rushed to the elegant 7th floor offices of the Secretary of State. Rusk told them the CIA's planes could go into battle to protect the beachhead, but not to attack Cuban airfields or harbors or radio stations. He asked if I should like to speak to the president, Cabell wrote. Mr. Bissell and I were impressed with the extremely delicate situation with Ambassador Stevenson and the United Nations and the risk to the entire political position of the United States, a situation created by Bissell and Barnes's lies. And so we saw no point in my speaking personally to the president. Trapped by his own cover stories, Bissell chose not to fight. In his memoirs, he attributed his silence to cowardice. When Cabell returned to the CIA's war room to report what had happened, Jake Esterline seriously considered killing him with his own hands. The agency was going to leave its Cubans to die like sitting ducks on that damn beach, Esterline said. Cabell's cancellation order caught the CIA's pilots in Nicaragua in their cockpits, revving their engines. At 4:30 a.m. on Monday, April 17th, Cabell called Rusk at home and pleaded for presidential authority for more air power to protect the CIA's ships, which were loaded to the gunnels with ammunition and military supplies. Rusk called President Kennedy at his Virginia retreat, Glen Ora, and put Cabell on the phone. The president said he was unaware that there were going to be any airstrikes on the morning of D-Day. Request denied. 4 hours later, a Sea Fury fighter-bomber swooped down on the Bay of Pigs. The American-trained pilot, Captain Enrique Carreras, was the ace of Fidel Castro's Air Force. He took aim at the Rio Escondido, a rust-bucket freighter out of New Orleans under contract to the CIA. Below him, to the southeast, aboard the Blagar, a converted World War II landing craft, a CIA paramilitary officer named Grayston Lynch fired at the Cuban fighter with a defective .50 caliber machine gun. Captain Carreras let loose a rocket that hit the forward deck of the Rio Escondido 6 feet below the railing, striking dozens of 55-gallon drums filled with aviation gasoline. The fire ignited 3,000 gallons of aircraft fuel and 145 tons of ammunition in the forward hold. The crew abandoned ship and started swimming for their lives. The freighter exploded in a fireball that sent a mushroom cloud rising half a mile high above the Bay of Pigs. From 16 miles away, on a beach newly littered with the brigade's dead and wounded, the CIA commando Rip Robertson thought Castro had dropped an atomic bomb. President Kennedy called on Admiral Arleigh Burke, the commander of the U.S. Navy, to save the CIA from disaster. Nobody knew what to do, nor did the CIA, who were running the operation and who were wholly responsible for the operation, know what to do or what was happening, the admiral said on April 18th. We have been kept pretty ignorant of this and have just been told partial truths. For 2 miserable days and nights, Castro's Cubans and the CIA's Cubans killed one another. On the night of April 18th, the commander of the rebel brigade, Pepe San Roman, radioed back to Lynch. Do you people realize how desperate the situation is? Do you back us up or quit? Please don't desert us. Am out of tank and bazooka ammo. Tanks will hit me at dawn. I will not be evacuated. We'll fight to the end if we have to. Morning came, and no help arrived. We are out of ammo and fighting on the beach. Please send help. We cannot hold, San Roman shouted through his radio. His men were massacred, standing knee-deep in the water. Situation for Air Support Beachhead completely out of our hands, the agency's air operations chief told Bissell in a cable at noon. Have now lost 5 Cuban pilots, 6 co-pilots, 2 American pilots, and 1 co-pilot. In all, 4 American pilots on contract to the CIA from the Alabama National Guard were killed in combat. For years, the agency hid the cause of their deaths from their widows and families. Still have faith, said the Air Operation Chief's cable, awaiting your guidance. Bissell had none to offer. At about 2 in the afternoon on April 19th, San Roman cursed the CIA, shot his radio, and gave up the fight. In 60 hours, 1,189 members of the Cuban Brigade had been captured and 114 killed. For the first time in my 37 years, Grayston Lynch wrote, I was ashamed of my country. That same day, Robert Kennedy sent a prophetic note to his brother. The time has come for a showdown, for in a year or 2 years, the situation will be vastly worse, he wrote. If we don't want Russia to set up missile bases in Cuba, we had better decide now what we are willing to do to stop it. This book is continued on Disc 7.
Good for Disc 7.
Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner, continued. Disc 7. Take the bucket of slop and put another cover over it. President Kennedy told 2 of his aides that Allen Dulles had reassured him face-to-face in the Oval Office that the Bay of Pigs would be a surefire success. Mr. President, I stood right here at Ike's desk and told him I was certain that our Guatemalan operation would succeed. And, Mr. President, the prospects for this plan are even better than they were for that one. If so, it was an astonishing lie. Dulles, in fact, had told Eisenhower that the CIA's chances in Guatemala were 1 in 5 at best, and 0 without air power. At the hour of the invasion, Allen Dulles was making a speech in Puerto Rico. His public departure from Washington had been part of a deception plan, but now it looked like an admiral abandoning ship. Upon his return, Bobby Kennedy recounted, he looked like living death, his face buried in his trembling hands. On April 22nd, the President convened the National Security Council, an instrument of government he had disdained. After ordering the distraught Dulles to start stepping up coverage of Castro activities in the United States, a task outside the CIA's charter, the President told General Maxwell Taylor, the new White House military advisor, to work with Dulles, Bobby Kennedy, and Admiral Arleigh Burke to perform an autopsy on the Bay of Pigs. The Taylor Board of Inquiry met that same afternoon, with Dulles clutching a copy of NSC 5412/2, the 1955 authorization for the covert operations of the CIA. I'm first to recognize that I don't think that the CIA should run paramilitary operations, Dulles told the board, a puff of smoke obscuring his decade of unblinking support for such operations. I think, however, that rather than destroying everything and starting all over, we ought to take what's good in what we have, get rid of those things that are really beyond the competence of the CIA, then pull the thing together and make it more effective. We should look over the 5412 papers and revise them in such a manner that paramilitary operations are handled in some other way. It's not going to be easy to find a place to put them. It's very difficult to keep things secret. The Taylor Board's work soon made it clear to the President that he needed a new way of running covert operations. One of the last witnesses before the board was a dying man who spoke with grave clarity on the deepest problems confronting the CIA. The testimony of General Walter Beadle Smith resounds with chilling authority today. Question: how can we in a democracy use all our assets effectively without having to completely reorganize the government? General Smith: a democracy cannot wage war. When you go to war, you pass a law giving extraordinary powers to the president. The people of the country assume, when the emergency is over, the rights and powers that were temporarily delegated to the chief executive will be returned to the states, counties, and to the people. Question: we often say that we are in a state of war at the present time. General Smith: yes, sir, that is correct. Question: are you suggesting that we should approximate the President's wartime powers? General Smith: no. However, the American people do not feel that they are at war at the present time, and consequently they are not willing to make the sacrifices necessary to wage war. When you are at war, Cold War if you like, you must have an amoral agency which can operate secretly. I think that so much publicity has been given to CIA that the covert work might have to be put under another roof. Question: do you think we should take the covert operations from CIA? General Smith: it's time we take the bucket of slop and put another cover over it. 3 months later, Walter Beadle Smith died at age 65. The CIA's Inspector General, Lyman Kirkpatrick, ran his own postmortem on the Bay of Pigs. He concluded that Dulles and Bissell had failed to keep 2 presidents and 2 administrations accurately and realistically informed about the operation. If the CIA wanted to stay in business, Kirkpatrick said, it would have to drastically improve its organization and management. Dulles's deputy, General Cabell, warned him that if the report fell into unfriendly hands, it would destroy the agency. Dulles wholeheartedly agreed. He saw to it that the report was buried. 19 of the 20 printed copies were recalled and destroyed. The one that survived was locked away for almost 40 years. In September 1961, Allen Dulles retired as Director of Central Intelligence. Workers were still putting the finishing touches on the grand new CIA headquarters he had fought for years to build in the Virginia woodlands above the west bank of the Potomac River, 7 miles from the edge of the Capitol. He had commissioned an inscription from the Gospel of John to be engraved in its central lobby. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." A medallion in his image was hung in the same soaring space. Si monumentum requiris circumspice, it reads, "If you seek his monument, look around you." Richard Bissell stayed on another 6 months. He later confessed in secret testimony that the vaunted expertise of his clandestine service was a facade. It was not the place where one would expect to look for professional competence. When he left, the president pinned the National Security Medal on his lapel. Mr. Bissell's high purpose, unbounded energy, and unswerving devotion to duty are benchmarks of the intelligence service, he said. He leaves an enduring legacy. Part of that legacy was a broken confidence. For the next 19 years, no president would place his full faith and trust in the Central Intelligence Agency. You are now living on the bullseye. In his wrath after the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy first wanted to destroy the CIA. Then he took the agency's clandestine service out of its death spiral by handing the controls to his brother. It was one of the least wise decisions of his presidency. Robert F. Kennedy, 35 years old, famously ruthless, fascinated with secrecy, took command of the most sensitive covert operations of the United States. The two men unleashed covert action with an unprecedented intensity. Ike had undertaken 170 major CIA covert operations in 8 years. The Kennedys launched 163 major covert operations in less than 3. The president had wanted to make RFK the new director of Central Intelligence, but his brother thought it best to choose a man who could afford the president political protection after the Bay of Pigs. After casting about for months, they settled on an Eisenhower elder statesman, John McCone. Almost 60 years old, a deeply conservative California Republican, a devout Roman Catholic, and a fiery anti-communist, McCone would very likely have been Secretary of Defense had Nixon been elected in 1960. He had made a fortune building ships on the West Coast during World War II, then served as a deputy to Defense Secretary James Forrestal, hammering out the first budget of the new Department of Defense in 1948. As Undersecretary of the Air Force during the Korean War, he had helped create the first truly global military power of the post-war world. As chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission under Eisenhower, he had overseen the nation's nuclear weapons factories and held a seat on the National Security Council. McCone's new covert operations chief, Richard Helms, described him as straight from central casting in Hollywood, with white hair, ruddy cheeks, brisk gait, impeccable dark suits, rimless glasses, aloof manner, and unmistakable self-confidence. The new director was not a man that people were going to love, said Red White, his chief administrator, but he quickly became very close with Bobby Kennedy. McCone first bonded with Bobby as a co-religionist and fellow anti-communist. The Attorney General's big white clapboard house, Hickory Hill, was only a few hundred yards from the agency's new headquarters, and Kennedy often stopped by the CIA in the morning on his way to work downtown at the Justice Department, dropping in after McCone's daily 8 a.m. staff meeting. McCone left a unique and meticulous daily record of his work, his thoughts, and his conversations, many first declassified in 2003 and 2004. His memoranda provide a moment-to-moment account of his years as director, along with thousands of pages of conversations secretly recorded by President Kennedy inside the White House, many not accurately transcribed until 2003 and 2004. They detail the most dangerous days of the Cold War. Before his swearing in, McCone tried to get the big picture of the agency's operations. He toured Europe with Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell. went on to a Far East station chief's meeting at a mountain resort north of Manila and immersed himself in paper. But Dulles and Bissell left out some details. They never saw fit to tell McCone about the CIA's biggest, longest-lasting, and most illegal program in the United States, the opening of first-class mail coming in and out of the country. From 1952 onward, working at the main postal facility at the International Airport in New York City, the CIA's security officers opened letters, and Jim Angleton's counterintelligence staff sifted the information. Nor did Dulles and Bissell tell McCone about the CIA's assassination plots against Fidel Castro, temporarily suspended after the Bay of Pigs. Almost 2 years would pass before the director learned of the murder plans. He never found out about the mail openings until the rest of the nation did. After the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy was persuaded to rebuild the clearinghouses for covert action that he had torn down after his inauguration. The President's Foreign Intelligence Board of Advisors was reestablished. The special group, later renamed the 303 Committee, was reconstituted to oversee the clandestine service, and its chairman for the next 4 years would be the National Security Advisor, cool, clipped, correct McGeorge Bundy of Groton and Yale, the former Dean of the Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. The members were McCone, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and senior deputies from Defense and State. But until very late in the Kennedy administration, it was left to the CIA's covert operators to decide whether to consult with the special group. There were more than a few operations that McCone and the special group knew little or nothing about. In November 1961, in the greatest secrecy, John and Bobby Kennedy created a new planning cell for covert action, the Special Group Augmented. It was RFK's outfit, and it had one mission: eliminating Castro. On the night of November 20th, 9 days before he took the oath of office as director, McCone answered his home telephone and heard the president summoning him to the White House. Arriving the following afternoon, he found the Kennedys in the company of a gangly 53-year-old brigadier general named Ed Lansdale. His specialty was counterinsurgency, and his trademark was winning Third World hearts and minds with American ingenuity, greenback dollars, and snake oil. He had worked for the CIA and the Pentagon since before the Korean War, serving as Frank Wisner's man in Manila and Saigon, where he helped pro-American leaders take power. Lansdale was introduced as the new chief of operations at the Special Group Augmented. The president explained that General Lansdale had been engaging in a study of possible action in Cuba, acting under the direction of the Attorney General. And he, the president, desired an immediate plan of action which could be submitted to him within 2 weeks, McCone recorded in his CIA files. The Attorney General expressed grave concern over Cuba, the necessity for immediate dynamic action. McCone told them that the CIA and the rest of the Kennedy administration had been in a state of shock ever since the Bay of Pigs, and therefore were doing very little. McCone thought nothing short of a shooting war would knock out Castro, and he believed that the CIA was unfit to run a war, secret or not. He told President Kennedy that the agency could not continue to be seen as a cloak-and-dagger outfit designed to overthrow governments, assassinate heads of state, involve itself in political affairs of foreign states. He reminded the president that the CIA had one fundamental responsibility under law: to assemble all intelligence gathered by the United States and then analyze it, evaluate it, and report it to the White House. The Kennedys agreed, in a written order drafted by McCone and signed by the president, that he would be the government's principal intelligence officer. His job would be the proper coordination, correlation, and evaluation of intelligence from all sources. McCone also believed he had been hired to shape the foreign policy of the United States for the president. This was not, nor should it have been, the role of the nation's chief intelligence officer. But though his judgment often proved sounder than that of the Harvard men at the highest levels of the government, he quickly discovered that the Kennedys had a number of novel ideas about how he and the CIA were to serve American interests. On the day President Kennedy swore him in, he found out that he and RFK and the unctuous General Lansdale were in charge of Castro. "You are now living in the bullseye, and I welcome you to that spot," the president told McCone at his swearing in. Out of the question. The president asked McCone from the outset to find a way to pierce the Berlin Wall. The wall had been erected, first barbed wire, then concrete, in August 1961. It could have been an enormous political and propaganda windfall for the West, hard evidence that the exorbitant lies of communism no longer served to keep millions of East German citizens from fleeing. It could have been a golden opportunity for the CIA. The week that the wall went up, Kennedy sent Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson to Berlin, where he received a top-secret briefing from the CIA's base chief, Bill Graver. LBJ gazed upon an impressively detailed chart showing all the CIA's agents in the East. "I saw this briefing map," said Haviland Smith, then a rising star at the Berlin base. "If you listened to what Graver said, we had agents in the Karlsruhe compound, the Soviet intelligence center, agents in the Polish military mission, the Czech military mission. We had East Berlin absolutely penetrated up to the goddamn eyeballs. However, if you knew what we had, you knew that the penetration of the Polish military mission was the guy who sold newspapers on the corner, and you knew that this big penetration of the Soviet military compound was a Dackermeister, a master roofer who fixed roofs." "Berlin was a sham," he said. The agency was lying about its achievements to the next president of the United States. David Murphy, then chief of the CIA's Eastern Europe Division, met with President Kennedy at the White House the week after the wall went up. "The Kennedy administration pushed us very hard to persuade us to devise plans for covert paramilitary action and the fomenting of dissidents in East Germany," he said. "But operations in East Germany were out of the question." The reason finally emerged in a document declassified in June 2006, a devastating damage assessment drawn up by Dave Murphy himself. On November 6, 1961, the West German chief of counterintelligence, Heinz Felfe, was arrested by his own security police. Felfe had been a hardcore Nazi who had joined the Gehlen organization in 1951, 2 years after the CIA took charge of it. He had risen rapidly through its ranks and kept rising after it became the official West German intelligence service, the BND, in 1955. But Felfe had been working for the Soviets all along. He had penetrated the West German service and through it the CIA station and bases. He was able to manipulate and deceive the CIA's officers in Germany until they had no idea whether the information they had gathered from behind the Iron Curtain was true or false. Felfe could initiate, direct, or halt any BND operations, and later some of CIA's, Murphy noted glumly. He had revealed to the East German intelligence service the essential details of every important CIA mission against Moscow from June 1959 to November 1961. These included roughly 70 major covert operations, the identities of more than 100 CIA officers, and some 15,000 secrets. The agency was all but out of business in Germany and across Eastern Europe. It took a decade to repair the damage. The president wants some action right now. The Berlin Wall, and all else, paled before the Kennedys' desire to avenge the family honor lost at the Bay of Pigs. The overthrow of Castro was the top priority in the United States government, Bobby Kennedy told McCone on January 19, 1962. No time, money, effort, or manpower is to be spared. But the new director warned him that the agency had little real intelligence on which to proceed. Of the 27 or 28 agents CIA now has in Cuba, only 12 are in communication, and these communications are infrequent, he told the Attorney General. 7 of the CIA's Cubans had been captured 4 weeks before after infiltrating the island. On RFK's orders, Lansdale drew up a to-do list for the CIA. Recruit and deploy the Catholic Church and the Cuban underworld against Castro, fracture the regime from within, sabotage the economy, subvert the secret police, destroy the crops with biological or chemical warfare, and change the regime before the next congressional elections in November 1962. Ed had this aura around him, said Sam Halpern, the new deputy chief of the Cuba desk, an OSS veteran who had known Lansdale for a decade. Some people believed Ed was a kind of magician. But I'll tell you what he was. He was basically a con man, a Madison Avenue man-in-the-gray flannel suit con man. You take a look at his proposed plan for getting rid of Castro and the Castro regime. It's utter nonsense. The plan boiled down to an empty promise: to overthrow Castro without sending in the Marines. Halpern said to Richard Helms, "This is a political operation in the city of Washington, D.C., and has nothing to do with the security of the United States." He warned that the CIA had no intelligence about Cuba. "We don't know what is going on," he told Helms. "We don't know who is doing what to whom. We haven't got any idea of their order of battle in terms of political organization and structure. Who hates whom? Who loves whom? We have nothing." It was precisely the same problem the CIA would face when it confronted Iraq 40 years later. Helms agreed. The plan was a pipe dream. The Kennedys did not want to hear that. They wanted swift, silent sabotage to overthrow Castro. "Let's get the hell on with it," the Attorney General barked. "The President wants some action, right now." Helms saluted smartly and got the hell on with it. He created a new freestanding task force to report to Ed Lansdale and Robert Kennedy. He assembled a team from all over the world, creating the CIA's largest peacetime intelligence operation to date, with some 600 CIA officers in and around Miami, almost 5,000 CIA contractors, and the third largest Navy in the Caribbean, including submarines, patrol boats, Coast Guard cutters, seaplanes, and Guantanamo Bay for a base. Some nutty schemes against Fidel were proposed by the Pentagon and the White House, Helms said. These included blowing up an American ship in Guantanamo Harbor and faking a terrorist attack against an American airliner to justify a new invasion. The operation needed a code name, and Sam Halpern came up with Mongoose. There is nothing on paper, of course. Helms chose William K. Harvey, the man who had built the Berlin Tunnel, to lead the Mongoose team. Harvey called the project Task Force W after William Walker, the American freebooter who led a private army into Central America and proclaimed himself the Emperor of Nicaragua in the 1850s. It was a very odd choice, unless you knew Bill Harvey. Harvey was introduced to the Kennedys as the CIA's James Bond. This seems to have mystified JFK, an avid reader of Ian Fleming's spy romances, for the only thing Bond and Harvey had in common was a taste for martinis. Obese, pop-eyed, always packing a pistol, Harvey drank doubles at lunch and returned to work muttering darkly, cursing the day he met RFK. Bobby Kennedy wanted fast actions. He wanted fast answers, said McCone's executive assistant, Walt Elder. Harvey did not have fast actions or fast answers, but he did have a secret weapon. The Kennedy White House twice had ordered the CIA to create an assassination squad. Under very close questioning by Senate investigators and a presidential commission in 1975, Richard Bissell said those orders had come from National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and Bundy's aide Walt Rostow, and that the president's men would not have given such encouragement unless they were confident that it would meet with the president's approval. Bissell had handed down the order to Bill Harvey, who did as he was told. He had returned to headquarters in September 1959 after a long tour as chief of the Berlin base to command Division D of the clandestine service. The division's officers broke into foreign embassies overseas to steal code books and ciphers for the eavesdroppers at the National Security Agency. They called themselves the Second Story Men, and their skills ran from locksmithing to larceny and beyond. The division had contacts with criminals in foreign capitals who could be called on for cat burglaries, the kidnapping of embassy couriers, and assorted felonies in the name of American national security. In February 1962, Harvey created an executive action program, codenamed Rifle, and retained the services of a foreign agent, a resident of Luxembourg but a man without a country, who worked on contract for Division D. Harvey intended to use him to kill Fidel Castro. In April 1962, the CIA's records show Harvey took a second approach. He met the mobster John Rosselli in New York. He picked up a new batch of poison pills designed to be dropped into Castro's tea or coffee from Dr. Edward Gunn, the chief of the operations division of the CIA's Office of Medical Services. Then he drove to Miami and delivered them to Rosselli, along with a U-Haul truck filled with weapons. On May 7, 1962, the Attorney General was briefed in full on the Rifle Project by the CIA's General Counsel, Lawrence Houston, and the agency's security chief, Sheffield Edwards. RFK was mad as hell, not mad about the assassination plot itself, but about the Mafia's role in it. He did nothing to stop the CIA from seeking Castro's death. Richard Helms, who had taken command of the clandestine service 3 months before, gave Harvey the go-ahead on Rifle. If the White House wanted a silver bullet, he believed it was the agency's job to try to find it. He thought it best not to tell McCone, correctly judging that the director would have the strongest religious, legal, and political objections. I once put the question to Helms personally. Did President Kennedy want Castro dead? There is nothing on paper, of course, he said evenly, but there is certainly no question in my mind that he did. Helms thought political assassination in peacetime was a moral aberration, but there were practical considerations as well. If you become involved in the business of eliminating foreign leaders, and it is considered by governments more frequently than one likes to admit, there is always the question of who comes next, he observed. If you kill someone else's leaders, why shouldn't they kill yours?
Yep. Tito.
A true uncertainty. When John McCone took over as Director of Central Intelligence, CIA was suffering, and morale was pretty well shattered, he recounted. My first problem was to try to rebuild confidence. But CIA headquarters was in an uproar 6 months into his reign. McCone started firing hundreds of clandestine service officers, aiming first to purge the accident-prone, the wife-beaters, and the alcohol-addicted, noted his deputy director, General Marshall S. Carter. The dismissals, the aftershocks from the Bay of Pigs, and the almost daily beatings from the White House over Cuba were creating a true uncertainty as to what the future of the agency may be. McCone's executive director, Lyman Kirkpatrick, told him in a July 26, 1962 memorandum. He suggested that perhaps something should be done immediately to restore morale in the agency. Helms determined that the only cure was a return to the basics of espionage. With some misgivings, he took his best men out of the paralyzed Soviet and Eastern Europe divisions and turned them on Castro's Cuba. He had a handful of officers under his command in Florida who had learned how to run agents and couriers in and out of communist-controlled zones such as East Berlin. The CIA set up a debriefing center in Opelika to interview thousands of people who had left Cuba on commercial airliners and private boats. The center interrogated some 1,300 Cuban refugees. They provided the agency with political, military, and economic intelligence, along with documents and the detritus of everyday life, clothes, coins, cigarettes, to help disguise agents infiltrating the island. The Miami station claimed to have 45 men running information out of Cuba in the summer of 1962. Some arrived in Florida for a 10-day CIA crash course and returned by speedboat under cover of night. The small spy network they built inside Cuba was the sole achievement of the $50 million Mongoose operation. Bobby Kennedy kept calling in vain for commandos to blow up Cuba's power plants, factories, and sugar mills in secret. Can CIA actually hope to generate such strikes? Lansdale asked Harvey. Why is this now called a possibility? Harvey replied that it would take 2 more years and another $100 million to create a force capable of overthrowing Castro. The CIA was so busy carrying out covert action that it failed to see a threat to the national survival of the United States gathering in Cuba. 18. We had also fooled ourselves. On Monday, July 30th, 1962, John F. Kennedy walked into the Oval Office and switched on the brand-new state-of-the-art taping system he had ordered installed over the weekend. The very first conversation he recorded was a plot to subvert the government of Brazil and oust its president, João Goulart. Kennedy and his ambassador to Brazil, Lincoln Gordon, discussed spending $8 million to swing the next elections and to prepare the ground for a military coup against Goulart, to push him out if necessary, Ambassador Gordon told the president. The CIA station in Brazil would make it clear, discreetly, that we are not necessarily hostile to any kind of military action whatsoever if it's clear that the reason for the military action is against the left, the president said. He would not let Brazil or any other nation in the Western Hemisphere become a second Cuba. The money started flowing from the CIA into the political life of Brazil. One conduit was the American Institute for Free Labor Development, an arm of the AFL-CIO. British diplomats in the know called it the AFL-CIA. Another was the Institute for Social Research Studies, a newly formed organization of businesses and civic leaders in Brazil. The recipients were politicians and military officers who opposed President Goulart and who kept in close contact with the new American military attaché in Brazil, Vernon Walters, a future deputy director of Central Intelligence. The return on these investments would be paid in less than 2 years. The White House tapes, transcribed in 2001, recorded a daily drumbeat of covert action plans taking shape in the Oval Office. On August 8th, McCone met the president at the White House to discuss the wisdom of dropping hundreds of Chinese nationalist soldiers into Mao's China. The president had approved the paramilitary operation. McCone was dubious. Mao had surface-to-air missiles, and the last U-2 flight that the CIA had sent over the Chinese mainland, McCone told the president, had been spotted and tracked by Chinese communist radars 12 minutes after takeoff from Taiwan. That's humorous, said Kennedy's national security aide, Michael Forrestal, the son of the late defense secretary. We'll give the president another U-2 disaster. And what would the cover story be this time? The president joked. Everyone laughed. 1 month after this meeting, Mao's forces shot down a U-2 over China. On August 9th, Richard Helms went to the White House to discuss the chances for overthrowing Haiti, 30 miles from Cuba. Haiti's dictator, Francois Papa Doc Duvalier, had been stealing American economic aid and using American military support to shore up his corrupt regime. The president had authorized a coup. The CIA had given weapons to dissidents who hoped to topple the government by any means necessary. The question of whether Duvalier would be killed had been weighed. McCone had given the go-ahead. But the CIA was bogged down. I might say, Mr. President, that the plotting doesn't seem to be very successful, Helms said. He warned that Duvalier's goon squads were a repressive force of no mean substance, which makes plotting a dangerous business. The CIA's best recruited agent, a former chief of the Haitian Coast Guard, lacked the will or the wherewithal to carry out the coup. Helms saw scant hope for success. Another coup really doesn't do any good if you don't have anybody to work with, the president told Helms. On August 10th, John McCone, Robert Kennedy, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara met in Secretary of State Dean Rusk's ornate conference room on the 7th floor of the State Department. The subject was Cuba. McCone remembered a suggestion being made to liquidate top people in the Castro regime, including Castro and his brother Raul, the Cuban defense minister, who had just returned from a weapons-buying trip to Moscow. He found the idea abhorrent. The director saw a greater danger ahead. He predicted that the Soviet Union was going to give Castro nuclear weapons, medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking the United States. He had been worrying about that possibility for more than 4 months. He had no intelligence, nothing to go on save gut instinct. McCone was the only one who saw the threat clearly. If I were Khrushchev, he said, I'd put offensive missiles in Cuba, then I'd bang my shoe on the desk and say to the United States, how do you like looking down the end of a gun barrel for a change? Now let's talk about Berlin and any other subject that I choose. No one seems to have believed him. The experts unanimously and adamantly agreed that this was beyond the realm of possibility, notes an agency history of McCone's years. He stood absolutely alone. There was a growing skepticism about the agency's ability to predict the Soviets' behavior. Its analysts had been consistently wrong for a decade. The CIA would come in and paint the most scary picture possible about what the Soviets would do to us. We were going to be second-rate. The Soviets were going to be number one, said former President Gerald R. Ford, who in 1962 sat on the cloistered House subcommittee that provided the CIA's secret budget. They had charts on the wall, they had figures, and their conclusion was that in 10 years the United States would be behind the Soviet Union in military capability, in economic growth, Ford said. It was a scary presentation. The facts are they were 180 degrees wrong. These were the best people we had, the CIA's so-called experts. The most dangerous area in the world. On August 15th, McCone returned to the White House to discuss how best to overthrow Cheddi Jagan, the Prime Minister of British Guyana, a wretched colony in the Caribbean mudflats of South America. Jagan, an American-educated dentist married to a Marxist from Chicago named Janet Rosenberg, was descended from colonial plantation workers. He was first elected back in 1953. Shortly thereafter, Winston Churchill suspended the colonial constitution, ordered the government dissolved, and threw the Jagans in jail. They were freed after the British restored constitutional government. Jagan was twice re-elected, and he had visited the Oval Office in October 1961. I went to see President Kennedy to seek the help of the United States and to seek his support for our independence from the British, Jagan remembered. He was very charming and jovial. Now, the United States feared that I would give Guyana to the Russians. I said, if this is your fear, fear not. We will not have a Soviet base. John F. Kennedy publicly proclaimed, in a November 1961 interview with Khrushchev's son-in-law, the editor of Izvestia, that the United States supports the idea that every people shall have the right to make a free choice as to the kind of government they want. Cheddi Jagan might be a Marxist, he said, but the United States doesn't object because that choice was made by an honest election which he won. But Kennedy decided to use the CIA to depose him. Not long after Jagan left the White House, the Cold War heated up in Georgetown, his capital. Previously unheard-of radio stations went on the air. Civil servants walked out. Riots took the lives of more than 100 people. The labor unions revolted after taking advice and money from the American Institute for Free Labor Development, which in turn took cash and counsel from the CIA. Arthur Schlesinger, a special assistant and court historian for the Kennedy White House, asked the president, "Does CIA think they can carry out a really covert operation, i.e. an operation which, whatever suspicions Jagan might have, will leave no visible trace which he can cite before the world, whether he wins or loses, as evidence of U.S. intervention? At the White House on August 15, 1962, the President, McCone, and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy decided it was time to bring matters to a head. The President launched a $2 million campaign that eventually drove Jagan from power. President Kennedy later explained to the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, Latin America was the most dangerous area in the world. The effect of having a communist state in British Guyana would be to create irresistible pressures in the United States to strike militarily against Cuba. At the same August 15th meeting that sealed Jagan's fate, McCone handed President Kennedy the CIA's new doctrine on counterinsurgency. Along with it came a second document outlining covert operations underway in 11 nations: Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, Iran and Pakistan, and Bolivia, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Venezuela. That document was highly classified because it tells all about the dirty tricks, McCone told the President. A marvelous collection or dictionary of your crimes, Bundy said with a laugh. On August 21st, Robert Kennedy asked McCone if the CIA could stage a phony attack on the American military base at Guantanamo Bay as a pretext for an American invasion of Cuba. McCone demurred. He told John Kennedy in private the next day that an invasion could be a fatal mistake. He warned the President for the first time that he thought the Soviets might be installing medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. If so, an American sneak attack might set off a nuclear war. He advocated raising a public alarm about the likelihood of a Soviet missile base. The President instantly rejected that idea, but he wondered aloud whether the CIA's guerrillas or American troops would be needed to destroy the missile sites if they existed. At that point, no one but McCone was convinced that they did. Their conversation continued in the Oval Office shortly after 6 p.m. on August 22nd, when they were joined by Maxwell Taylor, the general Kennedy trusted most. The President wanted to go over two other secret operations before discussing Cuba. The first was the developing plan to drop 20 Chinese nationalist soldiers into mainland China during the coming week. The second was a plan for the CIA to wiretap members of the Washington Press Corps. "How are we doing with that setup on the Baldwin business?" the President asked. 4 weeks before, Hanson Baldwin, the national security reporter for the New York Times, had published an article on Soviet efforts to protect intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites with concrete bunkers. Baldwin's highly detailed reporting accurately stated the conclusions of the CIA's most recent national intelligence estimate. The President told McCone to set up a domestic task force to stop the flow of secrets from the government to the newspapers. The order violated the agency's charter, which specifically prohibits domestic spying. Long before Nixon created his plumbers unit of CIA veterans to stop news leaks, Kennedy used the agency to spy on Americans. CIA is completely in agreement with setting up this task force, which would be a continuing investigative group reporting to me, McCone later told the President. The CIA kept watch on Baldwin, 4 other reporters, and their sources from 1962 to 1965. By ordering the Director of Central Intelligence to conduct a program of domestic surveillance, Kennedy set a precedent that Presidents Johnson, Nixon, and George W. Bush would follow. At this same White House meeting, the conversation finally turned to Castro. 38 Soviet ships had docked in Cuba in the past 7 weeks, McCone told the President. Their cargo might contain missile parts. We do not know. But either way, the Soviets were working to build up Cuba's military strength. Now, that would be separate from the question of whether they are building some missile bases, isn't it? Asked the President. Well, no, said McCone. I think the two are related. I think they're doing both. McCone left Washington the next day for a long honeymoon. A recent widower who had just remarried, He planned to go to Paris and the south of France. "I would be only too happy to have you call for me," he wrote to the president, "and if you do, I would be somewhat relieved of a guilty feeling that seems to possess me.
Why
Put
you
it
didn't
in the
want to get
box
married, buddy?
and nail it shut." A U-2 flight passed over Cuba on August 29th. Its film was processed overnight. On August 30th, a CIA analyst bent over his light table and shouted, "I've got a SAM sight." It was a surface-to-air missile, an SA-2, the same Soviet weapon that had brought the U-2 down over Russia. That same day, another U-2 was caught straying over Soviet airspace, violating a solemn American vow and prompting a formal protest from Moscow. The knowledge that Cuba had surface-to-air missiles created an understandable reluctance or timidity in the White House about authorizing new flights, McCone said later. JFK ordered General Carter, the acting director of Central Intelligence during McCone's honeymoon, to deep six the report on the SAM. "Put it in the box and nail it shut," the president said.
That's us.
He could not afford to let international tensions create a domestic
I know I can
political
wait another
uproar,
10 minutes,
not
but
with elections 2 months away.
it's good.
Then, on September 9th, another U-2 was shot down over China. The
If you're
spy
wondering, we are 8 hours and 21 minutes into the 12-hour, 28-minute book. So we will continue on there. It's pretty close to the end now of this video, but it's only part 1. And as the audio is pointing now, it's only in the 60s. This ends in 2007, I think. But God knows how long that'll take. Problem for next week. Right. At the risk of dating this, I will be live again on YouTube in a few hours. Get this for Meta. But then I will be over, I'll be there with Krendar. We'll be doing a live reaction. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm asking him when we're doing this. And he's just not gotten back to me so far. But then on Tuesday, I have UFF. It's becoming pretty commonplace now. Magicus will be tackling Final Fantasy 4 with me. Then on Wednesday, we have the return of Cyberpunk. Hell yeah. Then this will be uploaded on Thursday. How's that for some weird timelines for you? Friday, we're back here on Twitch for Yakuza. Then on Saturday, Bearded Ramblings, 218, Drake and Ignar shall return. As always, once this book is done, I'll be up for new suggestions. It doesn't even need to be an audiobook. It could be anything. I personally have no problem listening to a debate, or if you've got an album you want me to listen to for like 2 hours straight. If you got some stand-up comedy you think I might like, whatever. And as for next week, I don't know what I'll do on... Like, we didn't even get to Diamond City. We just... We fucked around with the Minutemen, and we fucked around with the Brotherhood. But that's really it. You all have yourselves a fantastic day, whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching this not live. And I will see you again very soon. Bye. Fuck the CIA for being a bunch of idiots.